My name is Disaster. I watched the dark blood spill on the blacktop and bones snap beneath 20-ton rigs. These highways are open-air mass graves, and every trucker delivering cargo out here feeds whatever starving thing waits in the dark. It was the midnight of 1978 in El Paso. Inside the freezing chill of a refrigerated semi-cab, Frank Miller sat hunched over the wheel, his breath pluming in pale wisps against the window. Frank was a ruthless driver who hauled illegal filth across state lines for green cash. Before hitting the interstate, Frank had backed his tractor unit to an unmarked loading dock behind a steel warehouse. Men in cheap ball caps slammed the heavy steel doors shut, slapping lead seals across the latches. They called it special imported meat cargo requiring a sub-zero freezer, warning him never to let the temperature drop. Frank didn't care about the dark, he only cared about the stack of $100 bills. He slammed the transmission into gear, rolling onto the empty highway. For 100 miles, everything felt routine, save for a sluggish drag and a foul odor seeping through the floorboards, a mix of heavy bleach, embalming fluid, and old blood. By 3 a.m., Frank was deep into Interstate 10. The dashboard instrument cluster flickered violently, and the trailer's digital temperature dropped into the negatives, flashing red. Beneath his feet, the vibration changed, replaced by a hollow thumping from deep within the trailer. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like heavy beef shifting, but with a sickening cadence. Frank stomped on the air brakes, the 18-wheeler groaning as rubber locked against asphalt. He threw the rig into park, grabbed an iron tire iron and a flashlight, and crunched toward the back. That was when he noticed what dripped from the rusted seams, not condensation, but thick, coagulated blood forming a wide puddle that attracted desert flies. What the hell? Frank muttered, jamming the steel lock bar up and swinging the massive door wide open. A monstrous wave of frost billowed out into the desert wind, carrying a stench so pungent Frank gagged, dropping his flashlight. It smelled of a slaughterhouse left sealed for decades, rotting human flesh, curdling bile, and copper. He snatched the flashlight and thrust the beam into the frozen darkness. The light bounced off stainless steel meat hooks. But they weren't holding beef. Suspended from the hooks by iron chains driven through their collarbones were dozens of naked, mutilated human bodies, their skin bleached white by frost. Some lacked limbs, others had their chests split open and stitched shut with nylon twine, staring blankly into the void. Frank stumbled backward, letting out a choked sob. No. No, he stammered, scrambling to slam the door. But before his fingers grazed the handle, one of the hanging bodies, a towering man whose legs were hacked off below the knees, swung violently forward, hurling its upper body out of the doorway and crashing onto Frank's chest. Frank hit the dirt hard, the wind knocked from his lungs as the frost-bitten horror landed squarely on him, its frozen jaws snapping. Its skin was necrotic purple, and thick black icicles hung from its torn throat, its eyes burning with unholy intelligence. "Get off me!" Frank screamed, flailing to punch its face. The thing let out a wet shriek, its blackened teeth sinking deep into Frank's shoulder, tearing through canvas and muscle down to the bone. A searing wave of pain shot through his body as warm blood gushed. He managed to throw the mutilated body off, but the movement left him bleeding profusely on the gravel. He looked up to see 3 more hanging corpses detaching from the ceiling hooks, dropping onto the metal floor with heavy thuds. They began crawling toward the doorway on their elbows and stumps, dragging their ruined bodies with relentless hunger. "God help me!" Frank whimpered, dragging himself backward away from the reeking maw. He reached his cab door, pulling himself up by the chrome grab handle, but his strength failed, and he collapsed on the metal steps. As he tried to push up, an icy hand shot out from beneath the trailer, wrapping its grip tightly around his ankle. Frank let out a final shriek as he was dragged across the sharp gravel, leaving a smeared trail of blood. He clawed frantically at the ground, but the unseen force pulled him toward the open doors of the refrigerated tomb. The heavy metal doors slammed shut behind him with a thunderous echo, bang, cutting off the desert wind and plunging the interior into absolute, pitch-black silence. Outside, the heavy diesel engine idled softly into the night, while inside the freezing dark, the heavy industrial locks clicked shut from the outside. The temperature dropped to 50 below zero, sealing Frank's flesh, blood, and wretched soul into the permanent inventory of the dead meat hall. Further north, past the bleak borderlands where the bitter winds howl across the empty plains of New Mexico, another heavy engine was burning through the midnight chill of 1978. Inside the claustrophobic cab of a battered Peterbilt, Arthur Vance gripped the wooden steering wheel with knuckles white from sheer exhaustion and a heavy paranoia that gnawed relentlessly at the back of his mind. Arthur wasn't hauling meat, he was hauling absolute silence. Massive industrial crates stamped with classified government numbers, bound for an unmarked research bunker buried deep within the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The pay was enough to clear his crushing debts and buy a fresh start in a new life, but the cargo had been loaded under armed guard by men who wore no badges, and who warned him with dead, empty eyes never, under any circumstances, to check the contents of the trailer. By 2 a.m., a heavy, suffocating fog rolled across the empty highway, wrapping around the 18-wheeler like a shroud of wet cotton and muting the deep roar of the twin diesel stacks to a muffled drone. The dashboard lights began to pulse with a sick, amber glow, casting long, writhing shadows across Arthur's face as he stared into the impenetrable wall of white mist ahead. From deep within the cold aluminum hull of the trailer behind him, a strange sound broke through the rhythmic drone of the tires, a sharp, rhythmic, metallic scratching, like iron nails dragging across corrugated steel. Scratch, scratch, scrape. Arthur slammed his boot onto the accelerator, his heart hammering violently against his ribs as he muttered frantic curses into the empty cab, trying desperately to convince himself it was just shifting cargo settling against the braces. Then the static-filled CB radio hissed to life with a sudden blast of violent white noise, followed immediately by a voice that wasn't human, a distorted, overlapping chorus of whispers speaking in a dead language that sounded like dry leaves scraping over ice. Arthur's hands trembled violently on the steering wheel as the temperature inside the sealed cab plummeted instantly, his heavy breath frosting thickly on the inside of the glass windshield. He glanced quickly into his rearview mirror, but the reflection showed no highway behind him, only an endless, abyssal void filled with floating fragments of rusted steel and glowing, hollow eyes staring directly at the back of his head. Panic seized his chest like a cold, iron fist. He jerked the steering wheel hard to the right, aiming to ditch the massive rig on the gravel shoulder and run into the freezing fog before whatever was trapped in the trailer could break through the bulkhead. Before the rubber tires could even leave the asphalt, the heavy iron latch of the rear trailer door blew open from the inside with a deafening, metallic shriek that echoed across the silent, unforgiving mountains. A monstrous blast of absolute zero air rushed forward from the open back, wrapping around the cab and freezing the door handles solid in a fraction of a second. Arthur screamed in raw terror, slamming his foot down on the brakes, but the heavy rig slid helplessly across a hidden sheet of black ice, spinning wildly toward a jagged drop-off carved into the side of the steep cliff. As the massive truck hurtled over the edge into the dark, bottomless abyss, the last thing Arthur saw in the mirror was a tall, skeletal silhouette standing proudly on the open threshold of the trailer, watching him fall into the endless night. Further down the twisting, unpaved service roads branching off from the main interstate, the midnight wilderness of 1978 grew thicker, darker, and entirely suffocating. Inside the worn-out, cigarette-stained cab of a rusted Mack truck, Miller Brooks wiped a thick layer of greasy sweat from his forehead with the back of a calloused, trembling hand, his breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Miller wasn't carrying government secrets or frozen meat, his ledger was filled with human cargo, desperate, illegal cross-border laborers locked away in heavy wooden crates bolted directly to the metal floorboards. The ruthless human traffickers who paid him didn't care if the people inside suffocated or froze, as long as they were delivered breathing to the abandoned lumber mill hidden deep within the northern timberlands. By 2:30 a.m., the heavy wooden crates in the back began to rattle violently, accompanied by muffled, desperate weeping and frantic, bleeding fingernails clawing desperately against the inner partitions. Miller turned the old radio up to a deafening volume to drown out the haunting, sorrowful sounds, his eyes bloodshot from days without sleep, his fingers digging into the cracked vinyl of the steering wheel until his joints turned pale. The air inside the cramped cab grew impossibly thick, smelling heavily of rusted iron, human sweat, and the sharp, coppery reek of fresh gore leaking from the cracks of the wooden containers. Without warning, the blinding headlights flickered and died completely, plunging the truck into absolute, suffocating darkness while the diesel engine choked, sputtered, and stalled out right in the middle of the winding dirt road. Miller cursed loudly, slamming his fists against the dashboard as he twisted the ignition key over and over, but the electrical system was completely dead, bathed in an unnatural, heavy silence. From the pitch-black cargo bed behind him came a deafening snap of splintering wood, followed by the heavy, echoing thud of multiple bodies dropping onto the metal trailer floor. The iron bolts securing the inner doors sheared off all at once with a metallic screech, and a wave of ice-cold air rushed into the cab, carrying the whispers of dozens of voices speaking in unison. Miller froze in sheer terror, his hand reaching slowly for the door handle, but before his fingers could touch the latch, a thick ring of frost spread rapidly across the glass of the driver's side window. The glass shattered inward with a sharp explosion, and multiple pale, blood-soaked hands reached through the broken frame, their iron grip locking brutally around Miller's throat. He tried to scream, but his voice was choked off instantly as the skeletal fingers crushed his windpipe, dragging his upper body halfway out of the shattered window into the freezing night. As the dark, shadowy figures swarmed over the cab from all directions, tearing the metal apart with supernatural strength, the last thing Miller heard was the mocking laughter of the road claiming its own. The biting frost crept further across the twisted dashboard, consuming the dials and freezing the remaining pools of sweat on Miller's lifeless skin. Outside in the deep timber, the ancient pines whispered secrets to the wind, mourning another soul swallowed whole by the midnight interstate. The quiet that follows a kill on the open road is never truly silent. It hums with the low, ominous vibration of idling engines, the steady, rhythmic drip of warm transmission fluid onto ice-cold asphalt, and the lingering echoes of choked screams that no living ear will ever hear again. Across the vast expanse of the American continent in the bleak winter of 1978, the dark veins of the interstate network hummed with a terrifying, ancient satisfaction, having devoured 3 more unsuspecting victims who traded their souls for a fistful of dirty cash. By 4 a.m., the desolate, wind-swept highways connecting the sun-bleached borderlands of El Paso, the frozen peaks of the Rockies, and the suffocating northern timberlands seemed to physically converge into a single, endless ribbon of cracked black asphalt under a heavy sky that stubbornly refused to bleed into dawn. The air across 3 different states grew unnaturally dense, smelling of burnt oil, ozone, and old, stagnant blood. In a dimly lit dispatch office perched above an abandoned truck stop off Route 66, a lone dispatcher named Harlan sat beneath the persistent, agonizing buzz of a flickering yellow fluorescent tube. The room reeked of stale black coffee, cheap tobacco, and ancient dust. Harlan stared blankly at a massive wooden chalkboard covering the main wall, its surface covered in hand-drawn highway grids, brass clocks ticking in unsynchronized beats, and names scrawled in white chalk that were slowly being erased. Harlan wasn't just tracking routes with chalk and pocket watches, he was the unspeaking ledger-keeper for the unseen entity that owned these dark roads, methodically updating the status of the 3 blacked-out rigs as their scheduled CB check-ins failed, one by agonizing one. He watched the minute hands click forward, knowing precisely what each silence meant. Frank's Sub-Zero reefer unit had gone completely dead silent near the Texas line, its internal temperature locked forever at absolute zero while human meat thawed and twisted inside. Arthur's heavy transport had vanished entirely over the cliffside, swallowed whole by the unnatural mountain mist and black ice. And Miller's battered Mack truck sat abandoned on a forgotten logging trail, its reinforced steel cab torn wide open like a cracked, bloody eggshell. Harlan didn't panic, nor did his expression flicker with a single shred of human remorse. He took a long, slow drag from his unfiltered cigarette, blowing a dense cloud of gray smoke against the smudged chalkboard where the three drivers' names were now nothing more than dusty smears. He leaned over his wooden desk, his calloused hand wrapping around the cold plastic of a heavy black rotary phone that had no external telephone lines running to the building. He lifted the heavy receiver to his ear and dialed a 7-digit sequence that never varied. "The 3 loads have been processed," Harlan said into the receiver, his voice flat, hollow, and utterly devoid of emotion, sounding as dead as the men he dispatched. "The meat, the silence, and the souls. The pavement is satisfied for another decade." A low, guttural breathing answered him through the copper wires, a terrifying sound like grinding tectonic stones and crushed gravel rolling in a cavernous throat, before the line went dead with a heavy, metallic click. Harlan hung up the receiver, picked up a wet rag, and wiped the remaining chalk marks clean, preparing the board for the next cycle of lost drivers. Outside on the desolate blacktop, miles away from the dispatch office, the 3 abandoned rigs didn't remain wrecked, ruined, or hidden in the shadows. Driven by an unseen, agonizing force that defied the laws of physics, their heavy diesel engines roared back to life in terrifying unison. Exhaust stacks belched thick plumes of dark smoke, and their round glass headlights cut through the pitch-black night with a blinding, unholy crimson light that scorched the surrounding brush. The mangled, blood-splattered trailers sealed themselves shut with supernatural force, the rusted iron locks snapping back into place as the entities trapped inside settled back into the freezing dark, waiting patiently for the next foolish driver who thought he was just hauling freight for easy money. The highways do not belong to the men who drive them, nor to the corporations that build them. They belong entirely to the ancient hunger beneath the asphalt, and as long as human greed leads desperate men into the dark, the haul will never, ever end. The highway does not forgive a man who carries a secret, but it positively devours the man who hauls a corpse. In the blistering autumn of 1979, the high desert of Nevada wasn't just a stretch of dirt and scrub brush, it was a furnace where men went to burn away their pasts. I had spent 15 years trying to outrun my own debts, an exhausting marathon that left me with hollow cheeks, fingers stained yellow from cheap tobacco, and eyes that twitched every time a siren wailed in the distance. My name is Jacob Vance, and that night, I was driving my ancient, slate-gray 1973 Kenworth W900. She was a beast of a rig, but her chassis groaned under the impossible weight of a custom, heavily insulated steel tanker. I wasn't hauling fuel, oil, or liquid propane. My freight was far more lucrative, and infinitely more illegal. Sealed inside that reinforced steel drum was 3,000 gallons of dense, chemically treated industrial ash, the incinerated remains of a subterranean research facility that had suffered a catastrophic biological breach near the Utah border. The men in tailored suits who handed me $5,000 in crisp, unmarked bills gave me 3 ironclad rules before I turned the key: do not stop for any stranded motorists, do not look in the side mirrors after midnight, and never, under any circumstances, tap on the side of the tank to check the fluid level. By 11:45 p.m., the moon was swallowed whole by a thick blanket of bruised, purple storm clouds. The suffocating heat of the desert day vanished, replaced by a sudden, bone-chilling wind that whistled through the worn seals of my cab windows. The long, straight stretch of Highway 50, the loneliest road in America, stretched out into the black abyss like a dead man's spine. I leaned forward, gripping the cracked vinyl steering wheel until my knuckles bled white. The dual exhaust stacks belched heavy black smoke into the night air, but the engine felt sluggish, straining as if the load behind me was growing heavier with every mile I covered. I glanced down at the illuminated dashboard, the mechanical oil pressure gauge was vibrating violently, its needle dancing dangerously into the red. Then came the sound. It wasn't the roar of the twin diesel stacks or the whistle of the high desert wind. It was a dense, wet thud coming from deep inside the sealed tanker, like a massive sack of soaked meat slamming against the inner steel wall. Thud, swish, thud. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Just fluid sloshing, I muttered to the empty cab, my voice trembling as I reached out to turn up the CB radio. Just chemical sludge settling. That's all it is, Jacob. Hold it together. I knobbed the dial, searching frantically for static or a friendly voice from a passing long-haul trucker, but all that spilled from the cracked speaker was a low, unnatural hum, followed by the sound of rhythmic, agonizing breathing. It sounded like someone gasping for air while their lungs slowly filled with wet silt. Jacob, a voice rasped out through the static. It wasn't coming over the radio waves at all, it felt as if it were whispered directly into my left ear, cold and thick with fine gray dust. You're pulling us, deeper. Panic seized my chest like a cold vice. I slammed my boot onto the accelerator, sending the massive rig surging forward into the darkness. But as the speedometer needle climbed past 70, the thumping inside the tanker grew faster, more aggressive, matching the frantic rhythm of the pulsing vein in my temple. Thud. 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 I couldn't help myself. Disregarding the second rule, I glanced up at my wide left side mirror. In the pale, flickering red glow of my taillights, the dark metal surface of the tanker wasn't smooth anymore. It was bulging outward. Massive, distorted impressions of human faces and elongated hands were pressing hard against the heavy steel from the inside, stretching the metal like warm wax, trying desperately to break through the skin of the tank. A high-pitched shriek ripped through the cab as the chemical ash inside began to boil. Thick, hot gray dust began to force its way out of the sealed pressure valves, pouring over the top of the trailer and swirling into the wind like a toxic, blinding blizzard. I stomped on the air brakes. The heavy tires screamed in agony as 60 feet of steel jackknifed violently across the empty highway, throwing up a massive cloud of dirt and blinding sparks into the midnight sky. The impact threw me violently against the driver's side door, my shoulder taking the brunt of the steel panel with a sickening crack. Sparks showered across the dark asphalt as 60 feet of jackknifed metal finally skidded to a complete, shuddering halt across both lanes of Highway 50. For a few long seconds, the only sound was my own ragged, desperate gasping and the fierce hissing of ruptured air lines beneath the cab. The headlights beamed uselessly into the surrounding desert sagebrush, illuminating nothing but swirling dust and twisting shadows. "Get out," I whispered to myself, my teeth chattering as pain shot down my left arm. "Just leave the rig. Run." I fumbled frantically with the chrome door latch, but the frame had warped under the sheer force of the sudden stop. It was jammed shut. That was when the smell hit me. It wasn't diesel fuel or burnt rubber. It was a thick, suffocating stench of ozone, wet concrete, and old, charred bones. Dense, boiling plumes of gray industrial ash were pouring out from the tanker's pressure vents, blanketed over the hood of my truck like a heavy, suffocating fog. The fine dust settled over the windshield, coating the glass in a layer of pale soot that began to creep inward through the air vents. My throat burned instantly. I gagged, coughing violently as the metallic taste of the ash coated my tongue. Then came the tapping. It started low and methodical, right against the back wall of the cab, mere inches from where my head rested against the sleeper berth partition. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't a random sloshing anymore. It was deliberate. It sounded like dozens of bare fingernails clicking rapidly against the cold steel bulkhead. I reached blindly under the passenger seat, my trembling hands wrapping around the heavy iron tire iron I kept for protection. My chest felt like an anvil was sitting on it as I turned my head slowly to look at the sleeper berth curtain. The fabric was bulging. Two distinct, elongated silhouettes of hands were pushing through the heavy cloth from the small window that connected the cab to the front face of the tanker. The glass of that small inspection window had already been shattered, reduced to fine powder. "You sealed the hatch, Jacob," a chorus of wet, raspy voices echoed from behind the curtain, speaking in a horrifying, synchronized rhythm that rattled my eardrums. "You took the green money, but you hauled us alive. Stay back." I screamed, swinging the iron bar blindly at the bulging curtain. The metal hit something dense and solid with a dull thud, but there was no flinching, no cry of pain. Instead, a pair of ice-cold, ash-covered arms burst through the fabric, their fingers ending in cracked, blackened nails that dug directly into the meat of my throat. The air was instantly cut off from my lungs. The temperature inside the cab dropped so fast that my tears froze against my cheeks. I thrashed wildly, driving the tire iron into the dark figures, but it felt like hitting wet clay. The skin on their arms was made of compressed, smoldering ash, crumbling under impact only to reshape itself around my skin. Panic gave me a sudden, desperate burst of strength. I planted both boots against the bent dashboard and kicked back with everything I had. The vinyl seatbelt bracket snapped. I slammed backward into the passenger side, tearing myself free from their suffocating grip. Without wasting a fraction of a second, I threw my weight against the right side door. The passenger door gave way with a loud screech, popping open into the freezing desert air. I tumbled out of the cab, hitting the sharp road gravel hard, rolling over several times until my knees and palms were raw and bloody. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air, the toxic dust coating my lungs like wet cement as I backed away from the idle, steaming Leviathan. In the pale red glow of the running lights, the steel tanker was glowing a sickening, dull cherry red. The thick metal walls were buckling outward in massive, grotesque bubbles, as if whatever was boiling inside had finally grown too massive for its iron cage. The rear release valves blew off with a deafening explosion of pressurized steam, sending heavy steel caps flying into the night. A wave of scalding, gray ash erupted from the back of the trailer, spilling out onto the highway like an avalanche of liquefied human remains. And as the smoke began to clear in the howling desert wind, the massive pile of ash on the asphalt began to rise, pulling itself up into tall, shambling shapes that turned their featureless, hollow faces directly toward me. The cold desert air blew thick clouds of scalding gray powder directly into my face, blinding me as I stumbled backward over the sharp road gravel. My lungs burned with every breath. Each inhalation felt like dragging broken glass down my windpipe, the heavy taste of sulfur and charred bone lingering on the back of my tongue. I wiped my streaming eyes with a bloody sleeve and stared in absolute horror at the wreckage of my rig. The heavy steel tanker was splitting open like a rotten carcass. Deep, glowing red fissures tore along its welded seams, unleashing a continuous tide of dense, boiling ash that slithered across the asphalt like a living fluid. And within that rising mound of gray soot, the figures were solidifying. They weren't human anymore, not entirely. They were tall, gaunt horrors woven out of compressed ash, melted glass, and twisted wires from the destroyed facility. Their limbs were elongated and jointed like broken twigs, and where their eyes should have been, empty, hollow sockets glowed with a faint, smoldering ember heat. "Run," my mind screamed, but my legs felt leaden, frozen in place by the sheer, paralyzing scale of the nightmare unfolding on Highway 50. The shapes moved in terrifying, jerky synchronized motions. Dozens of them pulled themselves free from the wreckage, their ash-coated feet leaving charred prints on the freezing road as they advanced toward me. 15 years of driving, 15 years of running. The voice didn't come from a single mouth. It echoed directly inside my skull, a chorus of dry, rasping murmurs that sounded like crushing dry leaves under heavy boots. You thought $5,000 would buy your freedom, Jacob. You brought the fire into the desert. I didn't know. I choked out, scrambling backward on my hands and knees as the lead figure stepped within arm's reach. I was just paid to haul the tank. I didn't know what was inside. The creature bent down, its featureless face stopping mere inches from mine. A wave of suffocating heat radiated off its skin, instantly blistering the flesh on my nose and forehead. You knew, the whisper hissed, cold as ice despite the heat. You smelled the rot when they locked the hatch. You felt the warmth through the steel. But you took the keys anyway. A skeletal arm reached down, its ash fingers locking around my left ankle. The moment its skin touched mine, a shockwave of agonizing heat shot straight up my leg. I screamed, a raw, tearing shriek, as the denim of my jeans ignited into miniature blue flames. The ash wasn't just burning my skin, it was creeping into my flesh, turning my blood to sludge, blackening the veins under my skin right before my eyes. Desperation tore through the agony. With my free right foot, I kicked wildly at the thing's chest. My heavy steel-toed boot sank into its chest like kicking a mound of dry soot. The creature stumbled back with a dry, hollow rattle, its grip loosening just enough for me to yank my leg free. I scrambled up and ran into the absolute darkness of the surrounding desert. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the Kenworth, the money under the mattress, or the dark highway behind me. I just ran through the sagebrush, my boots crashing into rocks and hidden gullies as the blinding sandstorm of hot ash followed close behind, swirling around my feet like hungry hands reaching from the earth. Behind me, the idle engine of my truck gave one final, deafening backfire that echoed across the empty mountain pass, and then, the night went dead silent. The silence of the high desert was far worse than the roar of the dying diesel engine. It was a dense, suffocating vacuum that seemed to press against my bleeding ears, broken only by the ragged, wheezing gasps tearing out of my own scorched throat. I collapsed into a dry wash half a mile off Highway 50, my hands digging deep into the cold desert sand. My left leg was a throbbing nightmare of third-degree burns, the skin blackened and covered in a fine layer of gray dust that refused to brush away. The ash had settled into my pores, moving under my skin like tiny, icy needles crawling toward my heart. I looked back over the ridge of sagebrush. The gray slate-gray Kenworth was no longer jackknifed across the asphalt. In the pale, unnatural glow of the desert stars, I watched in numb horror as the massive rig straightened itself out. The ruptured steel tanker smoothed over, the glowing fissures sealing shut with a horrific, wet sound like healing flesh. The running lights flickered back to life, not their usual warm amber, but a dull, sickening crimson that cast long, twisted shadows across the empty pavement. The heavy diesel engine turned over with a low, thunderous growl, belching two thick columns of black soot high into the freezing air. The passenger door slammed shut on its own. Through the glass, I saw the silhouette of a driver sitting behind the wheel. It wasn't me. It was a tall, gaunt figure made entirely of compressed ash and smoldering embers, its hollow, glowing eye sockets turned fixedly toward the empty road ahead. The air brakes released with a sharp, deafening hiss. The 18-wheeler accelerated, its heavy tires grinding against the asphalt as it crested the hill and disappeared into the vast, pitch-black void of the Nevada night, bound for another highway, searching for another desperate soul willing to take the wheel. I lay there in the dirt for hours, watching the sky refuse to turn to dawn. The cold had set into my bones, but the deep, internal burn of the ash inside my veins never faded. Around 5 a.m., the soft crunch of gravel signaled the arrival of headlights. A battered pickup truck pulled off to the shoulder near where my rig had crashed. An old man stepped out, his flashlight cutting through the lingering haze of gray dust that hung over the highway. I tried to call out to him, to warn him to stay away, but when I opened my mouth, no voice came out, only a dry, hollow puff of gray ash that scattered in the morning wind. He shined his flashlight into the dry wash, the yellow beam catching my shivering frame. He didn't look shocked or terrified. He looked at me with a weary, knowing sadness, as if he had found dozens of men like me scattered along the loneliest road in America. "Another one off the night run," the old man muttered to himself, stepping back toward his truck. "They always think they can haul the ash and keep their skin." He got back into his pickup and drove away, leaving me alone in the freezing sand. I looked down at my hands. The skin on my fingers was flaking away, turning to fine, pale soot that drifted into the wind. I wasn't going to die out here in the desert. The road doesn't grant its drivers the mercy of death. I was turning into the very freight I was paid to haul. As the first pale light of a sunless morning crept over the horizon, I pulled myself out of the wash and began walking down the endless black ribbon of asphalt. I am no longer a driver, and I no longer have a home. I am just another ghost embedded in the foundation of Highway 50, waiting for the sound of an oncoming engine. The asphalt of Interstate 80 through Wyoming doesn't just carry traffic, it buries it. Out there in the dead of winter, the prairie winds blow so hard they can peel the paint right off an aluminum trailer, turning the world into a featureless, blinding white void where time loses all meaning. My name is Hank Miller. I've spent 22 years behind the wheel of a heavy rig, pulling everything from flatbed steel to refrigerated produce, but in January of 1980, I took a job that broke every code I ever lived by. I was broke. The bank was threatening to foreclose on my home in Cheyenne, my wife's medical bills were piling up faster than I could open the envelopes, and my old 1974 Freightliner cabover was one blown head gasket away from the scrap heap. That was when a man in a pristine wool coat met me at a diner in Laramie and offered me $15,000 in cash for a single night's run. The cargo was a oversized, heavily armored vault trailer, a monolithic block of dull gray steel with no brand markings, no license plates, and no external doors. It had its own independent generator humming beneath the chassis, vibrating with a high-pitched, metallic whine that made my teeth ache just standing near it. The only instruction was simple: haul it 300 miles west to an abandoned rail yard near Evanston, keep the cab heater turned off at all times, and never step out of the truck if the external temperature gauge on the trailer spiked into the red. By 1 a.m., the blizzard had turned into a screaming ground blitz. The twin wiper blades on my Freightliner were fighting a losing battle against the ice crusting over the flat windshield, while the twin diesel stacks threw blinding plumes of white steam into the freezing gale. Inside the cab, it was an absolute icebox. My breath froze in thick, crystalline sheets on the inside of the door glass, and my fingers felt like brittle wooden pegs gripping the wheel. But the cold inside was nothing compared to the unnatural heat radiating from behind me. Through the thin wall of the cab, I could feel it. The vault wasn't cold like the night, it was burning. I glanced into my long convex mirror. The snow falling directly onto the gray steel trailer wasn't accumulating, it was vaporizing instantly on contact, creating a thick, swirling envelope of white steam that trailed behind my rig like the ghost of a locomotive. Then came the first impact. It wasn't a loose chains rattling or cargo shifting in a sudden turn. It was a massive, concussive boom from inside the sealed vault, a force so violent that the entire rear end of my 90,000-pound rig fishtailed 3 feet to the left on the slick ice. "Easy, easy!" I screamed into the freezing dark, wrestling the heavy steering wheel as the tires fought for traction against the frozen asphalt. "Hold the line, damn it!" Boom. The second strike was harder. It sounded like an iron wrecking ball slamming against a vault door from the inside. A strange, sickening smell began to seep into the cab through the floorboards, not diesel, not burning rubber, but the thick, sweet reek of copper, wet earth, and old formaldehyde. My CB radio, which had been silent for hours, suddenly burst into a violent cascade of white noise. The needle on the signal meter pinned itself completely to the right. "Driver," a voice groaned through the speaker. It wasn't distorted by radio interference, it was heavy, suffocating, and sounded like two heavy granite slabs sliding across each other. "The seal is cracking, driver. The frost is the only thing keeping the iron tight." My heart hammered against my ribs like a sledgehammer. I reached out with a gloved hand and killed the radio switch, but the voice didn't stop. It began coming directly through the floorboards, vibrating through the metal pedals and straight up into the soles of my boots. "Turn the heater on, Hank. Just a little warmth. Give us enough room to breathe." I looked down at the trailer's remote thermal gauge mounted on my dash. The needle was trembling violently, inching closer and closer to the bright red zone. The air in the cab was plummeting, yet sweat was pouring off my forehead and instantly freezing on my chin. I reached for the gear shifter to drop into low gear, intending to jump out into the blizzard, but as I looked into my mirror once more, I froze. The solid gray steel wall of the vault trailer was turning translucent. In the harsh red glow of my running lights, I could see what was trapped inside: hundreds of tangled, dark human shapes pressed tightly together, their faces flattened against the inner steel, their mouths wide open in a silent, collective scream that vibrated the glass right out of my dash frame. The sight of those writhing, shadowy figures pressed against the translucent steel made my blood turn to liquid nitrogen. The entire 90,000-pound rig shuddered as another massive impact rocked the vault trailer, the iron frame shrieking under a strain it was never engineered to hold. The temperature gauge on my dashboard didn't just inch into the red, the needle snapped against the stop pin, glowing with a faint, unnatural heat. I jammed my boot onto the clutch and yanked the heavy gear lever into neutral, coasting the massive freightliner onto the icy shoulder of Interstate 80. The air brakes groaned, belching a thick cloud of white condensation that froze instantly in the screaming prairie wind. "I'm done," I choked out, my voice cracking in the sub-zero air of the cab. "Keep the cash. I'm done." I shoved the cab door open, intending to dive headfirst into the knee-deep snowdrift and run until my heart gave out. But as my boots hit the frozen ground, a wall of suffocating, tropical heat slammed into my chest, knocking the wind right out of my lungs. The snow beneath the trailer wasn't just melting, it was boiling. Massive plumes of thick, gray steam hissed upward from the slush, obscuring the dark highway in a dense, swirling cloud that smelled of ancient mud and burning hair. I scrambled backward, slipping on the slick mud, and looked up at the side of the vault. The dull gray paint was peeling away in long, charred strips, revealing a strange, dark metal beneath that looked almost like bruised flesh. The translucent quality was fading, replaced by deep, glowing red veins branching across the entire length of the trailer like a spiderweb of raw electrical current. Thud. 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 The impacts were continuous now, a rhythmic, terrifying pulse from within. The heavy steel walls were expanding outward, bulging in grotesque, undulating waves as if whatever was trapped inside was trying to swallow the container whole. "Hank." The voice didn't come from the radio or the floorboards this time. It dripped down from the exhaust stacks, heavy, wet, and echoing with the voices of 1,000 dying men. "You opened the door when you stepped on the brake, Hank. The motion was the latch, the heat is the key. Shut up." I screamed, picking up a heavy iron tire thumper from the footwell of the cab and raising it over my head. "Get away from my rig." I swung the iron bar with all the strength left in my shivering body, slamming it against the side of the trailer. The moment the iron struck the glowing metal, a deafening sound, like a church bell cracking in half, echoed across the desolate prairie. The tire thumper dissolved instantly in my hands, reduced to a handful of glowing red slag that scorched my insulated gloves. The wall of the vault cracked. It wasn't a mechanical failure, it was a tearing sound, like wet leather ripping under tension. A wave of ice-cold, black fluid erupted from the fissure, spraying across the snow. Where the liquid touched the white ground, the snow turned pitch black and began to bubble, unleashing a stench so vile I fell to my knees, dry heaving into the mud. From inside the tear, a single hand reached out. It wasn't made of bone or skin. It was woven from thick, pulsating black roots and dripping tar, its long, clawed fingers locking around the cracked lip of the steel opening. Then came another, and another, dozens of dark, featureless arms clawing their way through the narrow breach, dragging a heavy, writhing mass of darkness out into the freezing Wyoming night. I tried to stand, but the heat radiating from the black pool trapped my feet in a slurry of boiling mud and melted ice. I watched in paralyzed terror as the mass began to rise, towering over the freightliner, its hollow, featureless head turning slowly toward the cab where my engine sat idling in the dark. The towering mass of writhing darkness rose above the cab of my freightliner, blotting out the howling blizzard and the faint red glare of the tail lights. It didn't possess a face, yet I could feel the suffocating weight of 1,000 ancient, hollow eyes locked directly onto me. The air around the rig transformed into a violent microclimate of extremes. On my left, the screaming prairie wind whipped sub-zero snow against my face. On my right, the heat radiating from the cracked vault trailer was so intense it blistered the skin on my neck, filling my nostrils with the reek of scorched metal and stagnant, copper-rich mud. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees through the slush, the sharp rocks embedded in the ice cutting straight through my jeans. "Stay back!" I choked out, my voice swallowed instantly by the roaring gale. The entity didn't strike or lunge. Instead, it expanded outward in a low, heavy wave, its tar-like tendrils creeping over the chrome bumper, the radiator grille, and the high fiberglass hood of my truck. Where the dark fluid touched the metal didn't just break, it aged decades in seconds. Chromed steel rusted into brittle orange flakes, paint blistered and peeled away like dead skin, and the heavy rubber tires softened into pools of black, viscous sludge. "You cannot run from the cargo, Hank," the collective voice echoed directly inside my chest, vibrating through my ribs with the force of a low-frequency earthquake. "Every road you have ever driven leads to this way station. Every mile was paid for in advance. I was just hauling a load." I screamed into the dark, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as my back hit the icy guardrail bordering the highway. I didn't ask what was inside. Ignorance is the contract, driver. The silence is the signature. A dense, freezing tendril of black mist separated from the main mass, whipping forward like a heavy leather strap. It coiled tightly around my right ankle. The pain was instantaneous and absolute. It wasn't the heat of fire, it was the agonizing, paralyzing frost of the deep void. The flesh of my leg went instantly numb, the veins under my skin turning pitch black as the dark fluid began to seep into my bloodstream, dragging me slowly across the mud toward the gaping, torn steel of the vault. Desperation took over. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my heavy brass Zippo lighter. My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped it into the slurry, but on the third frantic strike of the wheel, a tiny, flickering yellow flame caught the wind. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the burning lighter directly against the black tendril wrapped around my ankle. The moment the open flame touched the dark substance, the entity let out a high-pitched, agonizing shriek, a sound like a train jamming its brakes on dry steel rails. The tendril violently recoiled, igniting into a bright, violet-colored fire that spread rapidly along the length of the dark mass toward the trailer. The entity thrashed in agony, its immense weight slamming repeatedly against the side of the cab. The entire freightliner tipped sideways, its left tires lifting 3 feet off the frozen asphalt before slamming back down with a bone-shattering crash that shattered every remaining pane of glass in the cab doors. I pulled myself up onto my feet, ignoring the searing agony in my ruined leg, and lunged toward the driver's side door. I scrambled into the ruined, drafty interior, grabbed the heavy gear lever with both hands, and jammed it into low gear. I stomped my foot down on the accelerator with everything I had left. The twin diesel stacks roared, belching violent plumes of fire and black soot into the night. The rear tires, half melted and spinning on a mixture of ice and burning tar, finally caught a sliver of traction on the exposed concrete of the road. The heavy rig lurched forward, tearing itself free from the burning mass with a horrific sound of ripping iron. I leaned over the cracked steering wheel, my blood running cold as I looked into the rearview mirror. The burning, dark nightmare on the highway was pulling itself back together, setting off in a steady, relentless stride right behind my tail lights, matching my speed mile for desolate mile. The speedometer needle trembled against 70, but the speedometer meant nothing out here on the forgotten miles of Interstate 80. In my side mirror, the violet fire burning across the ruined vault trailer cast a long, horrifying glow over the snowbanks, illuminating the relentless, shambling mass that followed in my wake. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. Every time the heavy diesel engine roared and my tires chewed through another mile of black ice, the distance between my rear bumper and that dark, towering horror remained precisely the same. It was bound to the rig by the unseen chains of the contract I had signed the moment I accepted that envelope of cash in Laramie. The cab was a freezing wreck. Wind screamed through the shattered door windows, plastering my face with ice and fine black ash that drifted off the burning trailer. My right leg was completely dead from the knee down, the blackened veins under my skin glowing with a faint, icy violet light that pulsed in time with my failing heartbeat. I reached out with trembling, frost-bitten fingers and turned the dial on the dash. I wasn't looking for a radio station, there was no music or news out in this void. I turned the heater knob all the way to the red zone. The vent sputtered, blowing a sudden, scorching blast of dry, hot air into the cab. The reaction was instant. The voices inside my head didn't scream or groan anymore, they burst into a terrifying, harmonious laughter that shook the heavy steel frame of the Freightliner to its core. "Thank you, Hank," the collective whisper echoed, warm and suffocating like hot oil poured into my ears. The frost was our cage. The heat is our homecoming. In the mirror, the translucent steel of the vault dissolved entirely. The trailer was no longer a container, it was an open gateway, a churning vortex of black mud, burning ash, and thousands of writhing, shadowy hands reaching out into the Wyoming night. Ahead of me, the double white lines of the highway began to warp and bend, curving downward into an endless, subterranean descent that cut straight through the snow-covered mountains into absolute pitch blackness. There were no exit signs, no mile markers, and no oncoming headlights. Just an endless, spiraling ribbon of asphalt leading deep into the earth. My hands froze on the steering wheel. I knew if I stayed behind this wheel, I would drive this rig into the dark forever, hauling the damned across the hidden veins of the continent until my bones turned to soot. "Not me," I whispered through cracked, bleeding lips. "Find another driver." I locked my left boot onto the accelerator pedal, wedging my heavy iron tire thumper between the pedal and the lower dash frame to hold it down. The twin diesel stacks screamed in agony as the tachometer pinned itself into the red line, the heavy engine roaring like a dying dragon. I reached for the chrome door latch on the driver's side, unbuckled my belt, and threw my body outward into the blinding white void of the blizzard. The world went upside down in a violent blur of roaring wind, crushing impacts, and snapping bone. I rolled 50 yards down a steep, snow-covered embankment, my body smashing through frozen sagebrush and sharp granite boulders before coming to a violent, shivering stop in a deep drift at the bottom of the ravine. For a long time, there was only silence. I lay in the freezing snow, staring up at the dark Wyoming sky through one swollen, blood-filled eye. High above on the ridge, the roaring diesel engine of the Freightliner didn't fade away. It slowed down, coming to a smooth, idling stop right on the shoulder of the empty highway. Through the storm, I heard the heavy air brakes release with a sharp, mechanical hiss. The driver's side door clicked open and slammed shut. Someone else was behind the wheel now. The engine revved, a pair of crimson tail lights cut through the swirling snow, and the massive 18-wheeler rolled forward into the dark, vanishing down the endless black stretch of Interstate 80. I didn't die in that snowdrift. The frost didn't claim me, and the wolves didn't find my body. When a highway patrol officer pulled me out of the ravine 2 days later, my skin was white as marble, and my eyes were completely hollowed out by frostbite. But deep beneath my skin, the black ash still hums, pulsing softly whenever a heavy truck engine idles near the roadside in the dead of night. The highways do not belong to the living. They are the arteries of a vast, hungry ghost, and somewhere out there in the midnight fog, my old Freightliner is still rolling, waiting for its next driver to step up and take the wheel.